the Arctic is not destroyed by any step of the imagination, but it's changing fast, arguably faster than the rest of the world. Scientists have now shown that it's warming 4 times faster than the rest of the Earth. So I want people to understand this place before we lose it, lest we forget what it once was.
Hey folks, welcome to the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast. Our guest for this episode has a new book coming out October 22nd, being published by Patagonia, titled Into the Thaw, Witnessing Wonder Amid the Arctic Climate Crisis. The author and our guest for this episode is Jon Waterman, who in 1983 started working as a ranger in the Arctic and visited the region dozens of times over a 39-year period. After a 2021 trip with his son that Waterman wrote about for the New York Times, he decided to take a final extended 500-mile expedition by foot and packraft to the region to document the environmental and cultural changes of the climate crisis. In addition to his latest book, Waterman has written several books and for publications such as Outside and Men's Journal, and has received frequent grants from National Geographic. His writing has earned him several awards, including a literary fellowship from the National Endowment of the Arts, 3 Best Adventure Book nods from the Banff Book Festival, a National Park Service's Special Achievement Award, and the Sigurd Olson Nature Writing Award. This episode focuses in on Into the Thaw and what Jon witnessed over the course of his nearly 4 decades of travel in the Arctic. We talk about how he came to be interested in the Arctic, the changes he saw in the Arctic due to climate change from his first trip in 1983 to his final in 2022, and his relationship with the Inupiat people. There aren't too many writers and adventurers out there like Jon these days, so it was a real treat to get to speak with him about Into the Thaw. Make sure to grab your copy on October 22nd at your local bookstore, or you can pre-order it through the link in our show notes, which leads to a little virtual bookshop we set up with some of our favorite reads on bookshop.org. If you prefer to go straight there, the URL is bookshop.org/shop/ecosystem member. Bookshop.org/shop/ecosystem member. Without further delay, here's the latest episode of the Ecosystem Member Podcast with Jonathan Waterman, author of the new book Into the Thaw, Witnessing Wonder Amid the Arctic Climate Crisis. Today on the Ecosystem Member Podcast, we are excited to have Jon Waterman, author of the new book Into the Thaw from Patagonia Books. Thanks for joining us today, Jon.
Well, I'm psyched to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
So the theme of the Ecosystem Member Podcast is really about exploring our relationship with nature and the more than human world. One of the things you talk about in Into the Thaw is your relationship with the Arctic over an incredible 39-year period. You know, that's longer than most friendships, than a lot of marriages and relationships and sort of other human constructs. Like, when you think about your own relationship with nature and maybe specifically the Arctic, how do you define that? How do you think about that relationship?
Well, it's evolved over time, as you can imagine. But I have to think about what I wanted when I was a teenager. And I was a bit of an outcast as a teenager, and I wanted to get out into the mountains and into the wild places as early as 15 years old. And it started when I was 12, my first experience on an extended backpacking trip. And I quickly realized that I wanted to share that world with my friends and with other people, so they would not only understand what I was doing, that I wasn't a total eccentric, but that I wanted to share the beauty of it all. And then it quickly became apparent to me that it was important to share it because these wild places needed to be preserved. So to fast forward things a bit, when I discovered the Arctic, I kind of fell head over heels and really plunged myself into that world and began taking many trips, some of them quite extended. And I did that because my relationship evolved because I wanted to reduce things to their simplest form. Like, Thoreau said, I wanted to live life deliberately. And that's what I was chasing in the Arctic. That ability to sort of focus exclusively on everything that was surrounding me and get rid of all the noise and the radio and the TV, so that I had nothing but wildlife and landscape and seascape surrounding me. So I really wanted to understand the place so that I could share it. And then as I, of course, fast forward time a little bit more, I became even more concerned about what are potentially catastrophic changes in the far north.
And that's a really interesting way to think about this next topic that I want to talk about. So you are a former park ranger at Denali. You traveled the Arctic as a guide, some on these extensive trips that you talked about, and often very much in isolation and reducing things to the simplest place. And then, in 2021, you took a trip with your son that you wrote about in the New York Times, and you remarked that climate change had radically altered this place you once knew. Extreme rainfall, significantly warmer temperatures, and a delayed frost. But you were also at the same time still experiencing sort of the awesomeness of this place and of the Arctic. And I imagine what drew you a lot to it, having these wild blueberries and watching a grizzly and its cubs play and caribou shepherding their young calves. So, seeing a place over many decades, how do you process sort of the changes of this place and how it's being shaped by, sort of human-driven climate change? When really it doesn't see too many humans firsthand, as you talked about that isolation. So, how do you think about this relationship over time in that context of climate change, really radically altering it in front of your very eyes, like you were seeing this firsthand?
Well, I saw many of these changes over the years, but they weren't in front of my vision like they were in 2021, because I hadn't been to this particular place, the Noatak River, for more than 30 years. So, and I went there to share it with my son and another family. And I was quite shocked. And how did I deal with it? Well, I always went back to my fallback that I wanted to share the place. I immediately began writing about it. I started with an op-ed for the New York Times, and I realized that I needed to go back and document it more thoroughly to understand it, to get my arms around it. And this allowed me to process the many changes that I'd seen over the years as I began journaling, and while I was out on this extended trip the following year, 2022, it began to put everything into perspective so that I could sort of share a more cohesive view of nearly 40 years worth of travel in the North and how it had all changed. How do I deal with it? It's still, the Arctic is not destroyed by any step of the imagination, but it's changing fast, arguably faster than the rest of the world. Scientists have now shown that it's warming 4 times faster than the rest of the Earth. So I want people to understand this place before we lose it, lest we forget what it once was.
And part of that understanding of a place and sharing your story, what I thought was really interesting in Into the Thaw, you bookend the story, and we get to experience and read these sort of interpretations of your journal and extensions of your journal from all of those trips over the decade. But you bookend it by this amazing trip you took with a guy named Chris, 2022, that you just mentioned, and you did that on foot and packraft, covering 500 miles. Why did you choose to do that? That obviously wasn't the easiest decision. You probably could have done it in a much easier fashion. Why did you choose to do it that way? And is that part of like helping people understand and share this place, is like being there on foot and on raft, on water?
Well, I needed to slow things down so I could get my arms around it and reduce all the distractions so that I could really pay attention. And so I knew that was important. And I've always sort of come from this place where I need to challenge myself. I need the sort of the physical experience so I can really get engaged. But there was another reason too why we took this journey that way. And that was, I knew from past experience, if I was on this long journey and I came into these villages, into Noatak village and Kivalina, from the land rather than flying in, as most journalists do, as almost all journalists do, that I would have the respect of the villagers. And so not only would I slow myself down and really pay attention and be sharpened to what's going on around me, but I would have the full attention of the Inupiat or Inuit people whom I was meeting, so that I could spend some time with them, and they knew that I got it, that to me it was important to be out on the land, just as it is so important for them to be on the land.
And it's interesting too that you just mentioned the local villagers that you sort of gained the respect of and got the attention of by coming in this manner and traveling in this manner. What we talked a little bit about, relationship with the earth and relationship with the Arctic. What about your relationship with the local people? Like, how did that evolve over your decades of travel? Like, what tips and tricks, in addition to kind of showing up in a different way than most journalists, like how did you engage them on a human level, but also while they're experiencing these effects of climate change firsthand?
Well, it took me a long time to understand them. It was during a long journey I took more than 20 years ago that I really began to sort of tune into the way they were thinking. For instance, I learned that it was not polite to wish someone good luck, that you had to wish them good skill. When I saw an Inupiat or an Inuit person going out on a hunt, I'm not a northerner. I'm not an Arctic person. I go there to sort of change my mindset to try and understand them and how they see the world. And it was very important to plug into their understanding of the world.
And when you think about that understanding of the world, did that change over your trips? Like, was there a vast difference as, in the first trip in the 1980s to the trips that you were taking in the early, 2021, 2022?
Very much so. As a young man, I think I wasn't ready to slow down and process what they were saying. And I tended to be more inclined to be, I was interested in first, frankly, in mastery. I went on these journeys as kind of a test of myself, to be alone and to deal with the extremities of the environment and the storms and the sea and the wildlife. So it took many years, it took decades for me to go on this last trip, for instance, in 2022, and really listen, turn on the tape recorder within my head to process what they were saying to me, in order that I understood them. So yeah, it changed a lot for me over 40 years' time. And I began to see things more from their point of view as I got older, as I matured.
Yeah. And one of the things that you talk about, which, they're experiencing firsthand, and I think oftentimes, as with any of us, the places that we're in on a day-to-day basis, it's hard to see these changes because they kind of all blend together, versus if you go, one trip at the start of a decade and one trip two decades later, like the extremes can be more of a contrast. But you talk about this greening of the Arctic phenomenon, and listeners probably have a pretty clear picture of what the Arctic looks like in their head. Cold, white, snow, ice. Like, with this phenomenon of greening of the Arctic, how did this picture change over your dozens of trips to the region?
Well, it's hard to see that, again, that my experience in 2021, when I first went back to this place that I hadn't been to for more than 30 years, I saw it in my memory right away. I didn't have the photos to compare it to, but I knew that the place wasn't nearly as lush when I first was there in the Noatak in the 1980s. And so that place in particular really changed. I could see the change. but the rest of it was much more subtle. And it was only through reading a lot of scientific journals and listening to other climate scientists that I began to understand that the many things that had changed over the course of 40 years. It was only this, frankly, I'm so glad that I did this trip in 2021 with my son, because it was a place that I knew so well, and I could see the changes quite clearly. That as it warms, as the sea ice declines, it influences the land a great deal, and the brush and the trees begin moving northward, and it was clearly a different place.
And what was it like for your son, who didn't have the same background as you did in this place? Like, how did he experience it? What did he take away that he shared with you?
So he hadn't seen those changes. He only heard about them from me. And so, of course, he has heard about climate change. And like many teenagers, he was aware of it, and he's inheriting this earth that's warming up. But, I had impressed upon him that the Arctic is a special place, and it's very different from the world that we live in the lower 48. So, to answer your question, he was saddened about it. He was sad that the world was changing, and he had kind of a firsthand glimpse at it through his father, through me.
So when we think about man-made climate change, it's accelerated by human behavior, and then we think about natural changes over time, how places change. And you've been all over the world and written about a lot of different places. How do you think about the sort of change you see over time that might happen naturally, and that is accelerated by humans in the form of climate change? Like, is there a way that you think about what might happen and be occurring naturally, and what might be happening sort of artificially thanks to human behavior?
Well, it's very subtle, these changes. And it's very subtle because the Earth has been going through repeated phases of climate change since long before the Ice Age. For instance, the Earth went through a period before there were humans called the Permian extinction, where the Earth heated up so much that 95% of all life on the planet was destroyed. And so we've gone through these cycles. The difference is that we now have the technology to know that the period that we're in now, we've speeded up those cycles, and that we've actually caused them ourselves. And with the exception of a period of time 66 million years ago, when a meteor hit the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, there was this immediate change overnight. Another 70 or 75% of all species on Earth perished. This period now, the Anthropocene, human-caused climate change, we have sped everything up, and it's very different from these natural cycles in the Earth when we've gone through climate change. So it's an intellectual thing that you have to intellectualize this to realize that the Earth has changed before, but we have speeded it up so greatly that we are likely to see things disappear on the same sort of scale as they did when that meteor hit the Earth 66 million years ago.
It's an interesting way you put it, because you mentioned a few times in the book about the Inupiat people talking about how things are just moving faster. The Earth is moving faster, and they just talk about the speed there, which you just mentioned. How are they experiencing that? You talked about the Arctic being a different place than the lower 48. The pace of life is probably different. How that's impacting and how that speed is changing their daily lives. Like, what did you see? What did you observe about the impacts that's having as things move faster?
Well, I have to think about that. Some of it is sort of anecdotal. One instance was a family describing to me how their daughter had never heard thunder before. And, thunder and lightning didn't happen in the Arctic until very recently, because it's warmed up, and there are these thermal air masses now that move over the Arctic and create thunder and lightning. but in the Arctic, these people in a lifetime, they've seen these changes. Very different from us living down here. We're not so aware of them as they are. Sure, we see the heat domes and the wildfires and the extreme storms, but the places where they keep their food, they dig holes into the permafrost so that they can refrigerate their food. Well, they can no longer do that in many places because the permafrost in the ground is thawing and it's no longer cold enough to keep their food. So it's a very different culture because they live so close to the earth, and they see these things on a much more daily basis and a much more profound way because they depend upon the earth and they depend upon the animals to come back.
And you mentioned the permafrost there. I think permafrost is really interesting. Scientists, you talked about this in the book, but reading that scientists think the permafrost melts, it could release this methane that's been stored for decades, hundreds of thousands of years, potentially for some of it. And it could trigger this intense feedback loop. We just talked about speed. This intense feedback loop could even speed things up even more of just warming and thawing and, who knows what in terms of unknown microbes that are sort of locked in that permafrost. Being on the ground and seeing this and seeing the change of like not being able to freeze your meat in the permafrost anymore, are the local people understanding of what the changes could come, or are they just sort of trying to get through their daily lives? What did you experience, or what did you learn from them about how they're dealing with this in their daily lives?
Well, I have to impress upon you that these are some of the toughest people on Earth, and they're incredibly adaptable. And over the millenniums, they've learned to adapt to these enormous changes. Arguably, there have been people in Northwest Alaska, for instance, for 12,000 years. And so they've been around since living there since the last ice age. So they've had to adapt to these enormous climate changes, natural climate changes. So, or they've had to adapt to this tremendous food insecurity as the animals wax and wane and the migrations come and go over the decades. But now, with things speeded up, with the permafrost melting and the sea ice disappearing and the brush and the trees moving north, it's radically changed their lives in a way much more radically than our lives are changing in the southern biosphere.
And have you thought about what the Arctic might look like if you had the chance to go back in 5 or 10 years with this sort of rapid change that seems to be increasing in speed?
Yeah, I have. In many places in Alaska alone, the villages of Shishmaref and Kivalina and Point Hope, those villages are in all likelihood going to be under seawater, because not only because the ocean is rising, but simply because the sea ice is diminishing and the sea ice no longer buffers the shore. So these storms are flooding into these coastal villages and forcing relocation. So that's just one of many changes that they face. It's, sort of akin to wildfires in California. People are having to flee and relocate. The difference is it's not just wildfires in the Arctic, which they have now too. It's the permafrost is melting and the ground is collapsing. Infrastructure is falling into the ground, not only houses, but pipelines and roads.
We've talked a little bit about the human side of it, and I don't want to miss the non-human animal side of this, because I found that was one of my favorite parts of the book. Talking about your interactions with the caribou and the polar bear. There's this really amazing photo in the book. I think it was around like the 190 page mark of polar bear with its head, just out of the water. And it kind of looks like he has a smile on his face, like he's playing a game with you. And, you talk about fox and wolf and salmon and seals and graylings. And one of my favorite things is that every time you'd see a bear, you talked about how you'd say, "Hello, Mr. Bear." And it's just this interesting way of almost greeting and creating an interaction point. obviously the bears don't speak English, or any human language for that matter. But it was a really like a sign of respect in a lot of ways. Over those decades, we talked a little bit about your human interactions and how they sort of changed and evolved and what you learned. What about your relationships with sort of non-human animals? Like, what did you experience? What did you see? How did that change and shift over the decade?
One of the things that shifted was that I increasingly began to consider the idea that many Inuit believed that we share the same souls as these animals. And they believed that because, for one thing, because if they didn't respect these animals, they believed that the animals wouldn't return and nourish them and provide food for them. But it's a lovely point of view. It's very different from that of the Bible. And I embraced that very early on, more than 20 years ago. And it's a lovely way to see wildlife, let alone domestic animals. My dog at home. Otherwise, my relationship with the animals didn't change that much, because when I was a park ranger 40 years ago, I often interacted with grizzly bears at close range. And I learned early on to talk to grizzly bears. And I always said, "Hello, Mr. Bear," when I meet a bear. And when I meet animals, I tend to slow down and focus on the animal and what they're doing and what it means for me to be in their habitat and how to move through without interrupting them. But again, that lovely Inuit belief that we share the same souls as these animals is, I think it's a much more important way to live on the earth.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. And you had a little exploration of sort of the Inuit spirituality, and you talked about the story of Raven creating the people and the animals and plants they could eat. And, the Raven created the polar bear so that, the humans would have this sort of measure of respect for that being, and know, that they couldn't destroy everything. And you also write about sort of how Western Christian religions came in, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, it was, sort of side by side with that activity. And, I think I mentioned to you over email, I shared some stats from Pew where, sort of Christian-based religious followers had less a belief in man-made climate change than other religions or non-religious people. And what's interesting is you talk to a local villager named Vince, and he says when you're talking to him about climate change or the changes that he's experienced, he says, "Nothing we can do but trust the Lord, yet maybe people down south could lower their emissions," which is this really nice practical balancing of like, I understand the science, I understand what needs to happen, but there's also this religious aspect to it too. And, oftentimes that Christian religion sits next to, as you point out in the book, sort of these longer spiritual traditions. So, obviously, as someone who's coming in and experiences this community as an outsider, but someone who's visited often and knows this, like, that spirituality part, like when they think about climate change, when they see the changes that are happening, like, how do they balance that? How does that work?
Well, it's an interesting question because, a century ago, these villages up north, across the north, the process of assimilation began, and they were introduced to Christianity. And so Christianity is a powerful force in many of their villages, but it did not, in most villages, it did not eradicate their culture. They still have this lovely culture, and that it hasn't been completely lost, even if they go to church every Sunday when the church bell rings. So they're still close to the land and to the wildlife. The best way to explain this, I have a friend who lives in the Arctic. He's actually Caucasian, and he was raised in a sod home in the Arctic. He's a well-known novelist. In fact, his name is Seth Kantner. And he's somewhat of a bridge for me in my thinking about the people of the North, not only the Inuit, but the people whom Seth referred to as Arctic people. And that includes himself, both white and Inuit people, the Arctic people. And he recently, just in the last week, sent me an email and told me that the salmon haven't returned. And he's been a commercial fisherman. He makes his living fishing there in the Arctic for the salmon every year. And this year is the first year that the salmon haven't returned. And the caribou are also vanishing, largely due to the climate crisis. And he says that these animals are my friends. And he's adapted that sort of thinking from all the time that he's mentored underneath the Inupiat people. He analogized it to losing the salmon. And I know this is a stretch, and this will be a stretch for many listeners, but he analogized losing the salmon to if we lost all of our dogs in the lower 48, because they're important to the people there in that part of the Arctic, because they've always come back and they've always sustained them, just as the dogs in another way sustain us, even though we don't eat them.
Yeah, totally. No, it's really beautiful, as you said, the way that they think about their relationship there, and sort of bring our conversation to a close. And you know, think about that spiritual note a little bit. You talk about in the book how the mosquito bites were sort of your price to pay, and your strive towards Arctic enlightenment. You know, Into the Thaw, it's covering 39 years of your engagement with this region. Like, do you think you've made it to Arctic enlightenment? Do you think you've stretched further on that path? Maybe if you're not all the way there yet?
You know, my enlightenment is largely in my memory, and I'm so glad for the things that I've done. And this is something that the Inuit also believe. It just so happens that I didn't come to it through the Inuit philosophy, but through my own thinking. And that is that to find enlightenment, you have to suffer. And suffering is, in the Arctic, suffering is the cold and frankly, and it's the clouds of mosquitoes surrounding you. So, yes, I suffered a lot. I'm sitting here uncomfortable right now because I injured my back 2 years ago on my last Arctic trip. But I wouldn't trade this for anything. And I think that enlightenment is in my memory, and I'm glad for it. And I'm a creature of comfort these days.
Awesome. Well, the book Into the Thaw, it's incredible. This episode will be coming out just a few days before the book comes out, and so I encourage everyone to go check it out, go pick it up. It's a great read. Photographs are also equally amazing in there. So thanks so much, Jon, for writing the book, and going on these adventures and experiencing some of that suffering to translate it for us who maybe have never been to the Arctic. And thanks for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me.